Discount Disco Elysium? Yes, but is it worth your time and money? Let's find out, shall we? Welcome to Ye Olde Entertainment. My name is Alex, and as you know, it is my duty, my mission, my purpose in life to help you decide whether that game that you have been thumbing for so long is indeed the right game for you or not. 4 characters trying to sort out their lives who eventually end up pulling the thread of a large conspiracy veiled in mystery and intrigue. A story that takes place in an alternate version of Victorian London where there's minotaurs, cyclops, and other mythical creatures wandering about. A game that can best be described as a poor man's Disco Elysium, but that is still worth the price of the admission. That's the quick version of the review, on to the long one. Sovereign Syndicate is a game that sits somewhere in between point-and-click adventure game from the 90s and a combat-less RPG. And while I think it fails as both of these things, there is still some fun to be had with the title. It features a compelling story, interesting characters, and an immersive setting, and it is exquisitely written, but as an adventure game it fails to challenge the player in any significant way. For example, you have an inventory like you do in most point-and-click adventure games, but you don't ever need to figure out what to use where. If you interact with a point of interest and that interaction requires you to use an item, you are given a dialogue option that involves using the item, so the action happens automatically. You don't even have to figure out who to talk to next, or even the topic that you have to talk about. You have a to-do list on the upper left-hand corner of your screen, and conversations follow the classic RPG choose your line of dialogue mechanic. To me, Sovereign Syndicate also fails to deliver as an RPG. The story is structured in chapters. There are 4 playable characters, and you switch between them every time you complete a chapter. When you control a character for the first time, you get to choose its archetype, and this archetype determines the prevalent aspects of their personalities and their general approach to problem solving. Over the course of the game, you run into situations that may be approached in more than one way, and your skill level, along with the gods of RNG, determine the likelihood of success. You use a system of tarot cards instead of dice, but that's just cosmetic. And this is very RPG, in theory, but in practice I rarely felt like I had to find an alternative way to solve a problem because my skill was insufficient or because things didn't go according to plan. Things can go down differently depending on what you choose to do and on whether or not you pass or fail a skill check, but you don't ever feel as invested in a certain way to take care of a problem the way you did in Disco Elysium. If you compare these games vis-a-vis in regards to the player agency aspect of the experience, you'll get that in both games there's more than one way to navigate the game's challenges. In both games, your decisions have an impact on the story, but the main storyline and its main plot points remain the same no matter what you do. In both games, your decisions are acknowledged at the end of the game. But the big difference between these two games is that in Disco Elysium, Harry is not the same man at the end of the game that he was in the beginning. The events that take place in the game and the characters he meets are opportunities and challenges that test his resolve to become a new person. In dealing with these situations, he deals with his own internal demons and emerges at the other end of his own personal hell. He starts with a clean slate, and you, as the man or woman behind the wheel of his character, take him on a journey that goes from piecing together his past, to coming to terms with it, to embarking upon a new journey to become who he needs to be. But this does not happen in Sovereign Syndicate. There are rarely any decisions that you make or any alternative path that you're forced to take that makes you say, dang it, this is not how I wanted it to be. Now I'm going to have to do things this other way that I totally was not looking forward to. Take for example this passage that takes place early on in the game in Disco Elysium. You have to bring down a corpse that's hanging from a tree, and there's a big difference between taking care of that task all by yourself and asking someone else to help you. If you ask the Semini supremacist or Evard Clare, the leader of the dock workers union, to lend a hand, they are going to expect something in return, a quid pro quo that's going to require you to make uncomfortable compromises. Chances are you're going to try to bring down the corpse on your own, because not being in anyone's debt is always preferable, of course. But if you fail, you are going to be forced to ask these unsavory types for help. In Sovereign Syndicate, there is this part in which one of your playable characters can kill an unscrupulous landlord or let him be. If you don't kill him, some other playable character down the line will get the chance to talk to him and get some valuable information out of him. And some other NPCs will take different decisions. And while this sounds pretty impactful in theory, it doesn't really matter to your character. There are no personal stakes in this action, it doesn't make you feel like you're making a compromise with far-reaching consequences, and in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't make much of a difference. In Sovereign Syndicate, tasks and missions feel more like a to-do list, and less like something that you have to deal with because that's how you're also going to sort out your own internal shit. The game tries hard to do this, especially with the first character you play as, Atticus Daley, but it still feels somewhat detached. As for the practical aspect of RPGing and player agency, in Disco Elysium, your character had equipment slots, and there were interesting items on cloth garments with different stats that you could equip to boost your chances of passing this or that skill check. This made items matter, and this in turn provided the player with further incentive to engage in questing and exploration. In Sovereign Syndicate, you also have an inventory, but there are no equipment slots, and items get used automatically when you interact with the object that requires them. You have some consumables that boost some of your stats, but since failing a skill check doesn't really amount to much, there's little incentive for you to experiment with the items in your inventory. This is to say that the inventory mechanic in this game feels like an afterthought, and it's almost completely unnecessary. Perhaps the most frustrating thing about the RPG experience in Sovereign Syndicate is that in many crucial points you are given choices, but none of them allow you to steer the ship of the story away from the predetermined outcome. Your choices in the most crucial parts of the game amount to irrelevant different flavors of the same outcome, and sometimes they are the cheapest form of the classic illusion of choice that you get in RPGs. This changes for the better in the last stretch of the game. You can see some options and paths opening up as a result of your past decisions, and going off the beaten trail to talk to people that you don't necessarily have to talk to can yield interesting results. But while the final stretch of the game felt a little bit more player-driven, it wasn't enough for me to be curious about how things would have turned out if I had chosen different archetypes for each of the playable characters, or about what would have happened if I had done this instead of that. Despite the fact that it's not any more linear or path-branchy than Disco Elysium, because, like we said, the structure of the story in both of these games is very similar, I found it incredibly frustrating that by the end of the game, I was left with a feeling that I didn't really steer the wheel of the story in any significant way with my choices, and that's not a good feeling to be left with in an RPG. This may also be true of Disco Elysium, but the final photograph of Harry himself felt 100% like a result of my actions and decisions. Atticus, Clara, and Teddy do go through a character arc in the game, but I didn't feel like I was in command of said arc as much as I was with Harry Dubois in Disco Elysium. There is a fourth character that you get to play as, and surprisingly, that's the one whose character arc you have the most power over. Sadly, he's almost a secondary character in the game, and you don't get to play as him as much. Sovereign Syndicate truly shines in the narrative department though. The guys and gals who wrote this game knew what they were doing. The story unfolds as a consequence of characters setting out to accomplish their goals and running into obstacles that need to be sorted out. Some of these obstacles are often other characters who have their own goals and plans that happen to conflict with yours. Atticus Daley is the first character you get to play as. He is a minotaur who is a little too fond of drinking and gambling, and in the past, he has had dealings with shady types like gang leaders and prostitutes. The creature also commands strange mystical talents that happen to be of particular interest to a strange masked man who seems to be the key to everything. At the beginning of the game, Atticus is approached by said man. The stranger seems specially interested in his personal history and makes the strongly worded suggestion that indulging his curiosity is within everyone's best interest. Atticus somewhat reminds me of Harry Dubois in Disco Elysium, a man seeking to piece together his past so that he can come to terms with it and move on. Clara Reed is a prostitute who is seeking to leave London to return to her native America after pissing off the wrong people and coming to the realization that there was no gold pot waiting for her at the end of the rainbow of her British adventure. Of the characters you get to play as, this one's probably my favorite because her initial predicament feels more dire and her motivation stronger. Also, she's the only one who gets to fraternize with other characters enough for you to care about what might happen to them and about the things that you could do to aid them. Teddy Redgrave is almost as much machine and spare parts as he is a dwarf. I'd say his hybrid physique almost mirrors the dichotomy of a man who kills monsters for a living and tries not to get invested in the job beyond the scope of the contract at hand. Because like Geralt of Rivia in the Witcher series, he knows that monsters come in all shapes and sizes, the same as good-hearted people. His story in Sovereign Syndicate is that of a man who does what needs to be done for his contractors until it comes into conflict with his own idea of right and wrong. I like that the 4 characters have very distinct personalities and mindsets that are consistent with their backgrounds. As it happens in Disco Elysium, the game provides ample insight of what each character is thinking by means of an inner speech that takes the form of conversations between the different aspects of their personalities. They do feel rather scripted compared to Disco Elysium. In that game, it feels as though the different aspects of Harry's personality are more or less dominant depending on how much you favored them during the character creation process and every time you leveled. The game does feel a little bit pretentious and self-indulgent. And the little Oscar Wilde quotes that they throw in at the end of every chapter don't do much to dispel this notion. It seems to me like the game tries to sell you some deep subtext about the bigger questions of humanity, but I didn't find anything particularly thought-provoking in the game. If you check out my video on Disco Elysium, you'll see that I spent most of the video diving into the game's subtext, and into what, in my opinion, were the most relevant metaphors and the most important references, like Harry's conversation with the dice maker, Kim Kitsuragi and the voice he represented in the story, the presence of the Pale and the Kafkian prospect of its expansion, or Harry's epic moment dancing the night away at the cathedral turned disco. But you won't be getting any of that in this video because, well, although the story is pretty solid and very well written, I also think there's nothing more to it. The game takes on an interesting theme or two, like the conflict between those who believe that those who know better should seek ways to remove the ignorant from the decision-making process so that they can do what's best for everyone freely, versus those who stand on the side of freedom and consensus. There's also the moral implications of progress and some commentary about power and empowerment. I was mildly interested in the prostitutes of the story. They are presented as streetwise individuals who have figured out men thoroughly to the point of becoming cynical with the knowledge of which keys they need to press in each case to obtain what they want from them. People who always put on a facade and never give away their true thoughts and opinions, lest they compromise the chance of getting what they want. But people who are ultimately naive about many other things and are on the losing end of almost every power game, and they are reminded of this on a daily basis. Sovereign Syndicate feels more like an isometric, choose-your-own-adventure interactive experience than an adventure game or a combatless RPG, and all the way through I kept thinking of ways in which it could have been better. If it had been a choose-your-own-adventure interactive experience, it could have followed the style and presentation of Vampire the Masquerade Coteries of New York. I don't think that game was particularly good, but I think this type of presentation would have made the most out of the things that Sovereign Syndicate does really well: story, ambiance, and characters. But I think it could have also been a much better RPG if it had given the player the choice to choose one of the characters and stick to it throughout the entire game. Every playable character meets the other two as NPCs over the course of the game, so I don't think they would have needed to rewrite the story all that much to make this premise work, and I for one would have had a much greater incentive to play as the other two characters in successive runs. Sovereign Syndicate is a game that gets better as it goes, there is no question about it, but it also tests your resolve to push through a slow burn narrative, even as short as it is. I felt like it outstayed its welcome at times. I got the game for $10.
It was a fair deal!
And now it goes for $8.49 on Good Old Games. And I think the story, the characters, and the ambiance in this game are well worth the price of the admission. But if you are on a quest to play the best games ever made, if you like RPGs and you are a story-first guy or gal, there are better options, I think. You have Disco Elysium, which seems to be the main source of inspiration for this title, Citizen Sleeper, and Gamedec, amongst others. And I would recommend all those before Sovereign Syndicate for sure. On the adventure game end of things, I would go out on a limb and recommend that you check out Pentiment instead. Pentiment and Sovereign Syndicate are quite different, of course, but if you are into story-rich narrative games that don't revolve around combat, I am confident that you will enjoy any of these options a heck of a lot more. I know I did. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you are seeing on this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Come check us out on Discord if you don't mind all the boomer talk that goes on there. I personally love it and wouldn't change it for anything. Share the video if you thought it was cool, but most importantly, never stop gaming, but don't let gaming get in the way of your hopes and dreams. Bye everyone.